This is the Debunking Economics podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
The Archives.
Episode 92. Is energy efficiency a race to the top?
Welcome once again to the Debunking Economics podcast. I'm Phil Dobbie and Professor Steve Keen is with me as well. We've talked a lot about the importance of energy to the economy. In fact, is it so important that those with energy resources will always be the winning economy with a positive trade balance? Is energy efficiency a race to the top? In other words, that's today on the Debunking Economics podcast. Well, we have talked about energy as being the real driver of an economy. And Steve, you reckon the formula for production is wrong. It's not a function of capital and labour. You have to include energy in there. And I guess the question is, where does it go in? Because, I mean, capital and labour, they're almost interchangeable, aren't they, really? Because if you've got lots of people, they're just bad consumers of energy because they're not as efficient as machines. Whereas if you invest in capital, then you can automate stuff. And so you get a better return. So capital and labour are one thing. The other input certainly is energy.
Well,
isn't it?
The moment the machines are what determine your capacity to turn energy into useful work or into use products which embody useful work. So the machines are doing. This is so different to say 250 years ago when so much of the work was done by manual labour directly. The manual labour these days is really there to control the machines, sometimes to repair the machines. I think I posted a photograph on Twitter. People may have seen it, watching two engineers working on the nose wheel of my plane that I was flying back from Amsterdam to London in last week.
But soon, machines are going to be fixing machines soon, though, aren't they?
Machines will be fixing machines at some stage, and that is certainly the direction we're heading in. So your labour input is now ready to control the machines, to do what's necessary to make the machines function, and that labour is going to continue declining over time.
Yeah.
And what you see in terms of countries which have had enormous growth is they've used those machines to harness more energy and harness it more effectively. It isn't necessarily more efficient about how that's done, because we often have ended up using, when we make something more efficient, we end up using more energy with it rather than less.
Yeah.
It's really been an increasing amount of energy throughput.
But yes, it's the amount of energy you've got. So the amount of output that you can produce as a country or as a company is dependent on the amount of energy you've got access to, or the amount of or the cost of that energy and how efficiently you're using it, which is obviously
and how you transform it. So of course Japan's got almost no domestic energy sources, but clearly has been an extremely successful country in transforming the energy that it imports into useful products.
Yeah.
So that's the bottom line. Of success.
Right, okay, but and it's, good on them for doing that. If Saudi Arabia had done the same, then they'd be doing really well, wouldn't they? Because they've got access to, for a long time have had access to relatively cheap energy. They just haven't used it to produce other stuff. If they had used that energy to manufacture, and other energy-rich countries did the same, then non-energy producers, they'd be basically stuffed, wouldn't they?
Well, this is where actually Norway's a good comparison, because Norway's another oil-rich country compared to Saudi Arabia. And what Norway did with its, I'm not going to say it's a perfect country by any stretch of imagination, but what they did was say, we're going to get this enormous surplus out of North Sea oil. We're going to use that twofold: one, to build up a huge sovereign wealth fund, but also, secondly, to improve our infrastructure and our technology. And Norway was a very, very rural, I'm still going to use the word peasant. I better not use the word because I've got quite a few good Norwegian friends. G'day, Trond. But it was a very rural-oriented, low-tech society 40 or 50 years ago. And courtesy both of their own decisions to raise their technological level, but also courtesy of using the oil money to do that, it's now one of the most successful industrial nations on the planet. So you can do it. Now, what Saudi Arabia's done, it's just enormous wealth. We've seen the scale of the billionaires that have been created by the sheikhs at the top of the system. However, they have started to realise that they are going to run out of oil one day, or not be able to sell oil at once at some stage. So I understand there's actually quite a large devotion of money now to building solar technology in Saudi Arabia. And that may be their effective replacement for when that oil is no longer usable.
But what a surprise that they didn't, that's happening. I mean, it would come as a surprise to no one, but surely they would have thought decades ago, hang on a second, we've got all this energy. There's an opportunity for value add. We can use it as an input to the manufacturing process. If we own that manufacturing process here, first of all, we don't have to ship the energy anywhere. Secondly, we've got this relative advantage over those other countries who have to, if they haven't got any fuel, they're going to have to get people to do all the work, fueled by the vegetables they eat. We can do stuff so much more efficiently than they can. Why wouldn't they have done it decades ago?
Well, partly because they're informed by economists. Economists tell them comparative advantage is what you should be doing. So you should specialise in energy and let other countries specialise in manufacturing. Total nonsense, because what you should be doing is using whatever resources you have to invest and develop new technology and new manufacturing and production capability over time, which is what Norway has done, and also where I'm now based has done. Do you know what the world's second largest exporter of food is? Which country on the planet? Number one is America. What is number two country for exports of food?
I don't know. UK probably exports quite a bit of fruit and veg.
It's a net egg importer, I'd expect.
Oh, is it?
It's the Netherlands, where I am right now.
Oh, right, okay.
It's the second, and the reason is because they've gone for a dramatic increase in the technology level of their farming, and they've actually cut out 90% reduction in water use and almost eliminated pesticides by industrialising in terms of the greenhouses and things like that, and drip irrigation rather than spray irrigation and so on. So a country which has got incredibly high population density and very small amount of land is the world's second largest exporter of food.
Thank God, though, economists have badly advised the nations of the world on this idea of comparative advantage, because otherwise those people who were rich in energy resources would be trying to control the game.
Well, they do to a large degree anyway. But further. They'd be able to say, well, not only are we going to charge you a fortune for our energy, we're now going to charge you a fortune for all the goods that are produced using that energy. Yeah, well, the energy is, if you've got your hand on the energy, then you have an enormous advantage over those who don't have it. Yeah. But of course, what's actually happened, as we've seen in practice, is that countries that haven't had a domestic energy source have actually done better at saying, if we're going to harness that capability to produce goods more effectively. So Japan is the outstanding example, of course. Yeah. But again, we talked a bit in the last podcast, I mentioned Deming's name. Now, why did Japan adopt the ideas of Deming? It's because Deming, being American, tried to persuade American manufacturers after the Second World War that they had to improve their manufacturing techniques and to take this lean approach he was talking in favour of, rather than the straight stock standard Fordist production line. Let's develop a just-in-time system, not so much on the on minimum of warehousing and so on, but just a process which means you improve the production, a continuous improvement process over time. America, having won the Second World War and being the biggest bully on the planet, realized we don't need your advice. He was completely ignored, and he got an invitation from MITI, Japanese Ministry of Industry and Technology, and Trade and Industry. And he popped over to Japan, and when he arrived there, he said, look, at the moment, when you try to export products you're going to be producing low-quality stuff, people will laugh at it and say what a joke you are, and they'll only buy it because it's cheap. In 20 years, they'll be complaining about unfair competition from you. That's exactly what happened.
Yeah, but Japan has only got into that stage of being very efficient because they had to. So like saying Saudi Arabia hasn't because they've been able to be
a certain logic to it.
Yeah, Saudi Arabia has sort of like just been able to say, well, we don't need to, therefore we're sort of like we haven't developed.
Well, I was in Kuwait just recently. I don't think I'd go to Saudi Arabia. Kuwait is actually rather a more progressive country overall. But I've arrived, I think, very first thing in the morning, so it's still dark as I arrived, but it wasn't dark because in the drive from the airport to the hotel I was staying at, I went past a field which would have been, roughly speaking, say 20 hectares, say 80 acres of land, and it had lots and lots of lights and nice, neat rows. Nothing else there, just basically power being used. Yeah. Because they had the power, and it's almost free. It's virtually free in those countries. So you don't, having it on abundance means you don't necessarily think we have to make use of this stuff until such time as to develop ourselves over time, until you start to run out of it. That's what Saudi Arabia seems to be doing now.
So if God had been slightly more progressive, and when he was designing the world, he'd actually said, well, I'll tell you what, I can imagine how these countries are going to be divided up. I'm going to spread energy evenly amongst all of those so everybody gets access to the same amount. If he thought that hard, he only had 7 days, so I guess, he didn't get to that.
Yeah, a bit of a rush
bit of a
job,
rush job, wasn't it? I mean, as we've seen, there's lots of weaknesses which you could point to. But if he'd sort of just thought this through, so everyone had the same amount of energy, then it really would be a case, wouldn't it, of the most efficient user of energy creates the largest output, so they make
or the one that gets the most, harnesses the most energy. Again, it isn't so much efficiency. It's, and this is one of the things which I'll be doing the stats on this actually next week with Michael Kumoff and Tiago Domingo at the Bank of England to actually try to fit this information about GDP, the relationship between GDP and energy. And what you find is there's a very much straight line relationship between the amount of GDP as we measure it, which is a price deflated sum of widgets, which is how we measure it right now, and energy use. And the more energy, the more widgets. So it hasn't been a case of more efficiently using energy. It's using more of the stuff over time. Yeah. And if even just roughly speaking, it's quite probable that the amount of energy per head that we consume has risen of the order of 2%, 2 or 3% per annum, which means doubling virtually every 20 years. So over 2 to the power of 12 over the period of the Industrial Revolution. But that is one of the catches, which we've spoken about a couple of times. If you keep on doing that I think it's 450 years, doing it on the planet without any regard to what the other consequences of it. Forget global warming. The waste heat from that will be enough to boil water across the entire planet. Yeah. So the approach we've been using, which is basically not more efficiently using energy, but using more energy, that has a use-by date, and the use-by date was probably 1990.
Right. Presumably it will plateau, though, isn't it? Because there's only so much energy we can use. At some point, first of all, we're using it more efficiently, and secondly, to produce the same output. And secondly, at some point, surely the level of output's going to level off. We aren't going to keep on consuming at the same rate, are we?
Well, there certainly has to be a plateau. Again, one of my favorite blog posts is a blog post called Finite Physicist Meets Exponential Economist, or vice versa. And it's a physicist who sits down with the economist and reveals how little the economist knows about the real world, but points out that if we continue consuming so that we double per capita output every, 20, 25 years, then in 450 years, the surface temperature of the planet will be enough to boil water. In 1,500 years, it's enough to have the same temperature of the sun. And if we keep on doing it at this rate, we'll be, I think in 2,000 years, we'd be consuming the entire energy of the galaxy. Now, of course, we can't do that. So there is a limit. But I think what we've seen in terms of where really increased welfare has come from on an individual basis is increased use of energy. Yeah, it's the unfair distribution of that increase in energy, which is a huge part of our conflicts today and will be even worse in the future. But fundamentally, that rising rate of energy per head, you and I are probably consuming as much energy per head as Marie Antoinette.
Yeah.
Probably more.
Yeah. You
don't look as good either, but still.
I don't know. Well, she's decomposed quite badly. I think the
that's true.
Passage of age.
She's finally caught up with us. Yeah.
I'm going to say it's going to be marginal at best. Yeah. Look, we are going to use energy more, other sources of energy. This inequality which we've got, it's obviously largely driven by oil, but we've got other alternatives like sun and wind. Will they ever become as efficient as oil? I think they've got to.
This is the trouble. They can't become as productive, efficient in the classic sense of efficiency, which is used by energy engineers, and that's what they call energy return on energy invested. Yeah. And this is the real catch we face, because the amount of to get energy out, you have to put energy in to some extent. So if you and I were 10,000 years ago swinging from trees, to get that piece of fruit, we'd have to have eaten a piece of fruit the day before. And that gave us the energy to grab that piece of fruit. So there's always an energy input to get energy output. And what you want is to have that being a very high ratio, so small amount of work, large amount of energy return. In the case of oil, it was the biggest we've ever experienced in our species history, because in the very early days, the amount of energy you needed to put in to get oil out was of the order of 1 to 100 or 1 to 300, something in that range.
So the pressure just shot out the ground.
Yeah, that's right. And so and it's under pressure. If you put a hole and it hits an oil reservoir, it will come out of the ground. The hard stuff is stopping it. So that is the reason the oil age in particular gave us a false idea that we could keep on doing this indefinitely. Coal being far worse, of course, because coal is far more polluting than oil, and we have far more coal. I think we have about, at current usage rates, estimates are that the natural oil, the stuff we actually, drill a hole to get rather than the shale oil stuff, that will run out in something of the order of less than a century, whereas the coal at current usage rates would go for 3 centuries. Now, if we continue pumping the amount of carbon that's in that coal, the planet would have, 2,000 parts per million coal, and it would be about as the typical day in London would be a typical day on Venus right now, which you don't want to experience. So there are limits to how much we can consume of this stuff, but we have been consuming it as if we can keep on doing it indefinitely. And the days that being are numbered, and I said we're already gone past, I think, the peak point. We should have stopped doing what we're doing in terms of exploiting that carbon-based energy about 20 or 30 years ago.
But if you're in a country, say you're in North Korea, imagine you're Kim Jong-un just for a moment, and you don't have access to, I don't know what resources they do have in North Korea, but let's assume you don't have access to oil, and you wanted to just build your own ecosystem. You wouldn't worry. You'd just sort of like say, well, oil doesn't exist. I'm going to have to use inefficient energy sources like solar cells or maybe hydroelectric schemes, which I think are reasonably efficient, or I'm going to go nuclear, which is probably what he'd do, seeing as he's already got a penchant for that. Then you would, even if it cost you more to produce it, you're not going to. You're still able to create more efficiency out of that and develop your own ecosystem where you are getting more out of the energy that's
there's a real dilemma about
the issue is international trade, isn't it? If you make anything, it's going to be so expensive comparatively because of the energy input. But if it's just for your own closed ecosystem, you wouldn't have to worry about that.
Well, the trouble is you have to be net productive. I mean, you can't have to put in 1 kilowatt of energy to get 900 watts out. Right. You've got to have a positive, and there has to be a substantial positive before you can support anything other than a scraping existence. So the point of no return, in effect, of if you fall below this level, then you're going to go backwards, is something of the order of energy return, energy invested of 5. So in other words, you want to put no more than 1 kilowatt in to get 5 kilowatts back.
Right.
And in the early days of the photovoltaic cells, when they'd only convert, say, 10% of the electricity, 5% in some cases early on, of that electricity into energy, then the amount of work it took to build the photovoltaic cell in the first place was so great that over the life of the photovoltaic cell, it would return less than the amount of energy needed to build it. So we are now at the stage, there's all sorts of calculations I've seen about this. We should actually do a more detailed show on this particular point, mate, because it's a very important one. We're now looking at energy return and invested calculations in about the 10 to 30 range for what we're getting out of photovoltaic, what we can get out of them, and wind. So they are now getting to the stage where they can support, if they were an only energy source, they could support a fairly sophisticated society with fairly well-off individuals in it. But the trouble is, if we need to get there in a hurry, we won't be able to, because
and it would still it's still going to be cheaper to import oil from the oil-producing nations. We just
it's so long as the oil is still there. I mean, the oil of any of the resources which are going to run out of, oil is the one which is most obvious, because coal, as I said, there's 3 centuries worth of the stuff. Right. We're never going to run out of coal.
Now, we've spoken many times about how, governments have got this ability to print money, so they can issue bonds. Those bonds could be used to invest in infrastructure projects. It makes perfect common sense, doesn't it, that those infrastructure projects are energy related because they are the key input to your.
But again, even though you can make the money out of nothing, you've got to have an infrastructure project because you're net energy return.
Yeah.
And this has to be a substantial net energy return, so you have anything like a reasonable standard of living.
Are we at that stage, though? Are we at the stage? Are we close to that stage where that could be done? Like a country like the UK could say, "Yep, we are going to develop a vast set of our own energy resources, and we're going to do it with public money, and we're going to, even though it's going to be more expensive than oil, we are going to cut back on our oil imports."
that is the sort of decisions we're going to face, I think, in the next 10 to 20 years. But
right. What would happen if you went down that road? Yeah, first of all,
initially there would be a substantial fall in the standard of living because the amount of you wouldn't be putting more people into producing energy because there's no point doing it. You need to, but what you have is there'd be less net output per individual because if you see production as fundamentally using energy to do useful work, the amount of net useful work that could be done would fall dramatically, and therefore the standard of living would fall equally dramatically. So I think we do face that crunch at some point. But I've seen a lot of people, and I'm no expert in this area, but I take advice of engineers that I'm in touch with, and they tell me that we are going to be forced to go nuclear. Because nuclear has got a very bad name, courtesy of Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island and Fukushima and so on. But they said the engineers themselves continue saying to me, "Listen, our technology is far safer than you realise. Lots of advances have been made. The greenies, and they've got a positive negative attitude towards conservationists. They'll say the greenies have demonised the radiation damage and danger, et cetera, of nuclear power. But if you look at exactly the same issues, the danger and radiation and so on of coal, the amount of waste that's dumped into the atmosphere from coal usage actually exceeds what comes out of nuclear plants for the same amount of energy. It just happens
a bit quicker, and therefore
it's also much more focalised.
A bit more prominent in the news. That's right, because coal continues to destroy the environment. Isn't a front page newspaper headline, is it?
Yeah, the worst pollution we're doing to the planet is not nuclear.
Yeah.
It's CO2.
Yeah.
And so at some point we confront that, and we've got to shift over. And the fastest way we can do it, in terms of really high energy return, energy invested, is nuclear.
Right. So, and nuclear, of course, setting up nuclear plants is expensive. A very high upfront cost.
And you need highly educated people to do it, which is our point in the previous conversation. Right. But getting a good law degree doesn't tell you how to build a
nuclear power plant. So a logical approach would be then to say we'll use some of this money that can be created by the government to invest in a nuclear industry, which is going to make us provide us with an efficient source of energy where we're going to be less reliant on imports of oil. It's going to be ultimately better for the environment, and it's not going to compromise our standard of living if we get it right.
And we do the same thing in terms of teaching, of improving the skill level we have in photovoltaic technology and wind and tide, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we're going to be forced into these decisions in the next 20 or 30 years, and in a fairly drastic way. And the trouble is we have not prepared ourselves at all for those demands that society, that situation is going to put on us.
Right. Final question then, and I sort of asked it before. You talked about how, our energy consumption is increasing all the time. But are we going to reach a point of sort of peak energy where it's not that there's no energy available, because we can always find energy. As you say, it's just a question of whether it can be done efficiently or not, and presumably we'll ultimately, get better and better at that. But are we going to reach a point where we become so efficient at actually using that energy, not producing it, but using it, that we don't need any more energy? Like we can only watch one television set. We probably don't need to go to work as much. I can see that our energy consumption individually is going to possibly decline over the next decade.
Not decline. Well, it'll decline forcibly. I think it'll decline forcibly over the next 20 to 30 years. But in terms of over an enormously long span, at some point, and this is why I'm so glad I've got Elon Musk to point to, because I don't have to come across as being a space cadet myself. We're going to need to be a multiplanetary species. And when you're talking multiplanetary, it takes energy to get there. It'll take energy to make those planets into something habitable. And so as a species, we may well find, if we do survive the crunches we're going to go through, at some point we're going to be using an enormous amount of energy. Yeah. And I just recommend people to take a look at a concept called a Dyson sphere. Ever heard of a Dyson sphere?
No.
It's not a large vacuum cleaner.
No, it's going to say, I was wondering. Yeah.
No, it's a terraform, taking a neighboring planet, converting it into a sphere that almost completely surrounds the star in which your species happens to have evolved, and absorbing the energy of that star, and having your species existing on the inside of the sphere. And
it's not much of a life, though, is it? It's not. But just back to
the terrain would be a bit consistent, but that in terms of a species. I mean, I make comments like this to my students at Kingston every now and then, and they occasionally burst out laughing at some of the stuff that I say. And I said, if I spoke about you flying from one side of the planet to the other in less than 24 hours 1 century ago, do you reckon you would have laughed?
Yeah. Well, maybe a century ago you would have thought, because we're starting to see flight, you might have seen it as a natural extension. But look, just fundamental question, which is the title of this podcast: is energy efficiency a race to the top? In other words, is the richest country in the world in, say, 100 years going to be the country that has found the best way of making use of the energy that's available?
I think I wouldn't say energy efficiency, I'd say energy return and energy invested. The country that achieves success on getting a high energy return and energy invested in a non-carbon based energy source is going to be, if there's going to be any such thing as a global winner, that'll be the global winner.
Right. But I mean, that's an input, isn't it? So that's getting the best, most efficient input. But then how you use it is the other part of the equation. So are you developing the machinery that can manufacture more efficiently, for example? And
in transportation systems, are people going to be sitting in cars, or are we going to be in vacuum tubes? Traveling from one seat to the other. That sort of thing, that's partly using your energy more efficiently. So that is one thing we can do. But when you look at the actual level of, like even looking at light bulbs right now, for example, I use the example of that a human labourer's energy output is roughly equivalent to an old 100-watt light bulb. But these days we're using light bulbs with 2 and 3 watts of power, and they give exactly as many photons as the 100 watts ones used to do. So there's a 30-fold increase in efficiency that way. But once you've got to that point, when you now look at how many photons you get out of a 2 or 3 watt light bulb, can we get it to another factor of 10? The answer is no. About the best we can get a factor of another 2 or 3 perhaps. We're not going to see much below, in terms of sufficient lighting for a room, we're not going to see much of an improvement on a 1-watt bulb taking the place of a 120-watt bulb. So we are, in manufacturing the capability of the machines we make, we're reaching that maximum efficiency point already.
Right. But the country that becomes the most efficient at either manufacturing but also using, at creating energy or tapping energy, or the country that becomes the most efficient at using it or utilizing it. I mean, you'd assume that for a long time we are still going to have international trade in energy. So it's sort of going to level itself out in terms of the price that you pay. We're going to want to, as a planet, we are going to want to extract energy by the most efficient means. Surely it's going to be on a country by country basis, who is using it more efficiently. And I'm just wondering whether that is going to overcompensate, or not overcompensate, but compensate for the fact that there are countries that have got access to energy, which gives them a natural advantage. You see what I'm saying? That's
possible, but I think at the same time, because like in terms of the energy source you're going to have is solar predominantly, and I'm afraid that gives a definite advantage to those closer to the equator. So we might also see some large geopolitical shifts occurring over time, that the areas which were, left as wastelands comparatively to the temperate climates, since we've done such damage to the planet, they may be the ones where we have to move over time, because in terms of absorbing energy, they get more of it from the sun.
Right. Time to move back to Australia then. At some point. Good to
Take your suntan lotion.
We'll talk to you again, Steve. Thanks for your time.
Okay, mate. Bye.
Well, that was fascinating as always, wasn't it? Next time, well, there's no such thing as fractional reserve banking, even though lots of economists and bankers seem to think there is. Steve Keen will explain why it's just a fantasy and the way banks really work. And is there a case for full reserve banking? That's next week on the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. We'll see you then. Thanks for listening.